15 counties across central and upstate New York. And we work to eliminate housing discrimination and promote open communities. Most of our funding comes from HUD, as well as many of the communities we serve. And our organization works to investigate complaints of discrimination. We conduct undercover testing as part of those investigations, as well as systemic undercover testing to find hidden forms of discrimination in the housing market. We also provide counseling and advocacy to help individuals whose housing rights are being violated and legal representation to victims. We do a lot of education and outreach on fair housing rights and responsibilities for housing providers. And lastly, we do research and engage in policy advocacy to try to improve housing opportunity and achieve housing equity. And we continue to see a lot of fair housing issues and challenges in the work that we do. We still see outright denials of housing, oftentimes on the basis of disability or other protected status. We see evictions and lease non-renewals of individuals because of, for discriminatory reasons, or differences in the treatment, like the differences in the screening and application process, or differences after somebody's already moved in terms of how they're treated by their housing provider. We have housing providers who lie about the availability of housing. We see frequent denials of reasonable accommodations and modifications for people with disabilities. And we see discriminatory statements made by housing providers and harassment, including sexual harassment of tenants by housing providers. And last, we still see a lot of evictions of victims of domestic violence from their housing as well. And we still continue in our community to grapple with and work to address persistent patterns of segregation and concentration of poverty in our community. We have had a declining population in the city of Syracuse, which has led to abandoned and substandard housing and just generally poor quality housing. And our community has been dominated by sprawl in the suburbs that continues in spite of population stagnation and population decline, which of course leads to further disinvestment in the city itself. So as everyone, I think knows at this point, Syracuse and Central New York is one of the most segregated metropolitan areas in the country. This is a map, it's called a racial dot map of the population in the city of Syracuse by race. And each dot on the map represents 10 individuals, and it is color-coded by the race or ethnicity of those individuals. On this map, white non-Hispanic individuals are blue, represented by the blue dots, Black non-Hispanic by red, Asian non-Hispanic by green dots, Native American, Pacific Islander by brown dots, individuals with 2 or more races, I'm going to have trouble seeing the color on here, by the kind of dark red on here, and then finally Hispanic households represented by the yellow dots. And when you look at this map, you can see it's pretty obvious the patterns of segregation that we have in our community with largely African American Black population in the south side of Syracuse, and on the east side, Hispanic population on the near west side, somewhat on the east side. See a large Asian population on the north side of Syracuse, and somewhat in the university neighborhood. And you can see the stark line here in particular that I81 creates between the south side of Syracuse and the university and outer Comstock neighborhoods. That racial segregation, of course, becomes even more obvious when you zoom out of the map and look at Onondaga County as a whole. So this is that same map, but done for the entire county. And again, you see those same patterns where you see the concentration of African Americans, Black households, in the city, Hispanic households, and you see in the suburbs, really largely white population in most of the suburban towns and villages in central New York. And then in addition to being one of the most segregated communities in the country, of course, where you live matters, and we are also one of the worst scoring communities when looking at equality of opportunity based on race. This is a study done a few years ago now by the Urban Institute that ranks Syracuse as 97th out of 100 cities when looking at equality of opportunity based on race, and 92nd out of 100 communities when looking at equality of opportunity based on ethnicity. We are one of only 5 cities in the country that scored in the bottom 10 on both measures. And one last, of course, well-known study looking at these issues in Central New York was the study of concentration of poverty, in which Syracuse ranked the worst city in the country when looking at the concentration of poverty for Black households, as well as the concentration of poverty for Hispanic households. So we present this information a lot to different audiences, high school students, real estate agents, and the question that we always come back to and that is always asked is why? Why do we have these persistent patterns of housing segregation, disparities in opportunity, and concentrated poverty? And when you look back, and I'll go back a couple slides here, when you look at those cities that we share this distinction with in terms of, particularly in terms of the Black concentration of poverty, almost all of the cities share a lot in common with Central New York. We have, of course, our neighbors, Rochester and Buffalo, in this distinction. We have other cities like Detroit, Toledo, Cleveland, Gary, Indiana, cities that all have, of course, a lot in common, and that we're all cities whose population peaked in the 1960s, 50s and 60s, and that have seen a steady decline in our population since then, which means we're all communities that tend to be still largely impacted and shaped by historical practices that occurred while housing discrimination was still legal, and not just legal, but encouraged by the federal government and local and state governments. So to understand those patterns, we have to, of course, look back. And we have to look at historical practices that created patterns of segregation in our community. We start here with 1934, which the National Housing Act was passed, which created the Federal Housing Administration. And the Federal Housing Administration worked to increase home ownership by ensuring that home loans that were made by private lending institutions to help insure those loans against default helped increase home ownership significantly. However, the underwriting standards that were created by the Federal Housing Administration specifically advised lenders not to provide loans unless there was a racially restricted covenant in place for that property, and essentially kept housing these home loans that were guaranteed by the federal government from being available to Black households. VA loans had similar practices at the same time as well. And these racially restrictive covenants, which I'll talk a little bit more about later, required that there was a guarantee in the deed that prohibited the occupancy of properties except by the race for which they are intended. Around the same time in 1937, we have the Homeowners Loan Corporation, which was also created by the federal government, that was created to help slow a nationwide wave of foreclosures that was occurring as a result of the Great Depression. The Homeowners Loan Corporation allowed homeowners to refinance their mortgages over longer amortization periods, so to help stabilize the housing market that was really in free fall at the time. And of course, the Homeowners Loan Corporation needed to assess how those, whether loans were considered risky and create criteria for determining which loans would be able to be refinanced. And they did that by going into communities across the country, 239 cities total, and rating neighborhoods in those communities based on the level of risk. And we developed at that time then the practice, this created the practice known as redlining. So this is the 1937 residential security map that was created by the Homeowners Loans Corporation for the city of Syracuse. And in Syracuse and all these other communities, they rated these neighborhoods based on four-colored scale. Green meaning best, Blue is still desirable, yellow definitely declining neighborhoods, and red were neighborhoods that were considered hazardous, meaning that if you needed to or wanted to get a loan in those red neighborhoods, it was going to be impossible. And even in yellow neighborhoods, those loans were going to be more expensive, if not also impossible to get. So you'll see in Syracuse, of course, areas that were green tended to be areas that the rankings tended to favor suburban and newer communities, newer construction, as well as older, wealthier neighborhoods. In Syracuse, you can see green areas in DeWitt, Meadowbrook neighborhood, as well as in the neighborhoods Sedgwick and Strathmore that were considered the areas that were considered the best. We have blue neighborhoods surrounding there. We now Eastwood, Tipperary Hill, and parts of the north side. And then you have your yellow neighborhoods that were declining, which includes much of the south side and some of the near west side and west side, some of the north side, and then you have in the inner ring suburbs also considered declining, East Syracuse, Mattydale, Galeville here, and Solvay. And then you have your neighborhoods that were considered hazardous. That includes, of course, the neighborhood known as the 15th Ward, neighborhoods on the east side where actually Route 690 is now, and neighborhoods on the near west side and west side of Syracuse, as well as Nedrow, just south of the city. And the criteria that was used was not just what the conditions in terms of the buildings and the structures in those communities, but the criteria that was used also included the racial and ethnic makeup of those neighborhoods. Neighborhoods in which there was an African American population were automatically considered rated as red, even if that was a middle class African American population. This is the actual redlining report from 1937 for the neighborhood that was now the neighborhood known as the 15th Ward. And you can see the concern at the time, in particular the concern they had with what was called an infiltration or shifting of individuals into that neighborhood. I'm not going to use the language they used in 1937, but you can read it for yourself. This is the redlining map for Nedrow, again, just south of the city. And here they again talk about the shifting or infiltration of individuals into that neighborhood. That was why it was considered or classified as red and hazardous. And then you have the neighborhood kind of near west side, or not, excuse me, not near west side neighborhood, Park Ave neighborhood here. Again, infiltration here of just generally less desirable individuals. And so individuals in these neighborhoods couldn't then invest in their homes, and those homes began to steadily decline. You also had at the same time those restrictive covenants that made it difficult, if not completely impossible, for particularly for Black households to move out of those neighborhoods that they were in, those redline neighborhoods. This is an actual restrictive covenant from a Syracuse area home. This is actually from a house in the university neighborhood. And this is the restrictive covenant for that house. And it talks specifically about how that particular lot and that house could not be conveyed to Black owners or tenants during the period, at this point, 25-year period from the date of that deed. This is language is still in the deed. This is a screenshot of the actual deed from that house. And you can find these restrictive covenants not just in neighborhoods in the city of Syracuse, but you can find them in suburban neighborhoods that were beginning to develop at that same time. And then housing discrimination, of course, was still legal at the time. And you had, systematic efforts and systemic efforts by groups like the National Association of Real Estate Boards to maintain and create segregated communities. This is the code of ethics from the National Association of Real Estate Boards that was in place up until 1950. They actually didn't fully replace this language until several years after the Fair Housing Act because they couldn't agree on a replacement. But it reads that a realtor should never be instrumental in introducing into a neighborhood a character of property or occupancy, members of any race or nationality, or any individuals whose presence will clearly be detrimental to property values in that neighborhood. What that means is that as a real estate agent, not only were you allowed to discriminate in this time, not only were you allowed to segregate populations, you were actually required, if you wanted to be a member of the real estate boards, you were required to discriminate and to segregate populations. So our communities, and particularly in the Near West Side and other communities, ended up suffering from several decades worth of disinvestment. And the response, of course, was the policy known as urban renewal. Urban renewal is the policy of the federal government with support from local governments to clear neighborhoods that were considered slums. This, of course, is an image of I81 running through downtown, being constructed and built in downtown Syracuse in the neighborhood that was the 15th Ward. At the time that I81 was built, 90% of African Americans in central New York lived in the 15th Ward. I'm going to switch my screen over to an image that will show you the extent to which urban renewal changed the look of how our community looked. This is a screenshot of Syracuse from before urban renewal. And you can see here, just to get your groundings, if anyone needs their bearings, here is the Armory Square, here is the War Memorial, here is Clinton Square, so you can get your groundings. University is down this way off the map. And you have here the neighborhood known as the 15th Ward. You can see the small houses and businesses and buildings that dominated that neighborhood. And this is our community after urban renewal. And you can see that same neighborhood first with the construction of I81 through the center of it. But it wasn't just I81 that was built over top of that neighborhood that replaced that neighborhood. You also have places like the Everson. You have the convention center and garage and parking lot. You have the residential towers along Townsend. You have the parking garages for Upstate, the Hutchings campus, and this entire area of public safety buildings, Civic Center. I'll go back so you can see it again before and after. And it's really quite remarkable when you see it that way. You can see the extent of the destruction of that neighborhood. I'll get back to my slides now. There we go. So neighborhoods like the 15th Ward in Syracuse and neighborhoods and communities across the country endured urban renewal policies that demolished those neighborhoods. And the residents of those neighborhoods were displaced and ended up having to move, often with little, if any, compensation. And you had new discriminatory practices that arose at that time as a result. You had the practice of blockbusting. So as African-American tenants of the 15th Ward began moving to neighborhoods, particularly in the south side or the east side of Syracuse, real estate agents used scare tactics to go into those neighborhoods, and they would tell white homeowners that they needed to sell their homes because Black families were moving into the area and moving into the neighborhood. Some real estate agents even went as far as hiring women, Black women, to push strollers through the neighborhood so that the white homeowners would see the Black residents in the neighborhood, or not even residents at that time, people they were paying, they would see them in the neighborhood and be induced to sell their houses. The real estate agents would then buy those houses at reduced prices and then increase the prices and sell those homes to Black families who had been displaced. Of course, much higher prices, and often through things like land contracts that had really predatory practices, made it very difficult to actually achieve homeownership in those homes. And the result of that blockbusting and other practices was that we started to see massive amounts of white flight in central New York. As we began, of course, the suburbs are developing. They were relatively cheap because they were heavily subsidized, and you had things like the creation of highways that made it really easy to move further and further away from the city where most jobs were located. So in central New York, this chart shows the percentage white population for both the city of Syracuse and Onondaga County. And you can see in the city of Syracuse in 1960, 94% of the city of Syracuse was white, 94%. By 2010, it was 55%, and the most recent numbers available, 2018, the white population in the city of Syracuse is 50%. In Onondaga County also, you can see increasing diversity in Onondaga County as a whole, which went from 97% white to 77% white, which is kind of reflective of national trends for increasing diversity, but certainly nothing compared to the loss in white population experienced in the city of Syracuse as white residents fled into the suburbs. And we had another practice by both the federal government as well as our state governments to locate affordable housing and subsidized housing in urban communities that helped further concentrate poverty. Starting in 1939, of course, with the construction of pioneer homes, which you can see here, is located right here on this map. This map shows all HUD subsidized housing units, which includes public housing as well as other types of HUD units. This map's a couple of years old, but not much has changed because the federal government has not invested substantially in housing since 2012 and even longer. So unfortunately, we can probably continue to use this map for a long time because we don't see the type of investment in housing that we need in our communities. And so this map shows how most subsidized housing, HUD subsidized housing, is located in the city of Syracuse. And we actually don't even have a map of Onondaga County showing this because there is not a single public housing unit in the rest of Onondaga County. Every single public housing unit in Onondaga County is located in the city of Syracuse and is located in neighborhoods that were previously redlined or yellow lined. The result of all this, of course, is that while the city of Syracuse has 1/3 of all the housing units in Onondaga County, the city has 75% of the subsidized rental units are within the city. So city has 1/3 of all housing units, but 75% of subsidized rental units. And what's more is a lot of the subsidized rental units that exist in the county outside of the city of Syracuse tend to be targeted towards seniors. Only about half are targeted towards families. So after these decades of discriminatory practices and really segregation created and led by the federal government, the federal government finally decided to act to address, to make housing discrimination illegal I was going to say they began to work to address housing segregation, but their efforts on that have really been pretty limited. But they did finally in 1968 make housing discrimination illegal with the passage of the Fair Housing Act, and which made it illegal to discriminate in rental or sale of housing based on race, color, national origin, and religion. They later added gender, disability, and familial status. And the Fair Housing Act banned many of those practices that we saw in the previous decades, like restrictive covenants and discrimination by real estate agents, as well as lenders, and in rental housing as well. Unfortunately, the Fair Housing Act did not initially contain strong enforcement mechanisms, and it largely went unenforced for the next couple of decades. So before we had the Fair Housing Act, we saw segregation promoted and maintained through blatant discriminatory practices. Things like this sign, which is from a Detroit neighborhood from the 1940s when there was a public housing development announced. But we still see our communities, and we still see segregation maintained in our communities. We just now see it done in much more subtle ways. And we see it done by proxy. And I'll explain what that looks like. So prior to the passage of the Fair Housing Act, there was an executive order passed in 1962 that was going to desegregate. The goal was to desegregate public housing. Prior to the 1962, public housing was legally segregated, and all public housing in central New York was segregated. And in 1962, federal government decides to desegregate public housing, and they passed the executive order. However, in 1968, when they were debating the Fair Housing Act, this is from a quote from the legislative record from 1968, where they were debating the Fair Housing Act. While they were debating the Fair Housing Act, a couple of the senators had noted that public housing, despite having that executive order, public housing still did not desegregate. And they were trying to understand why, kind of realizing that passing law was not enough. Having the law on the books to desegregate public housing was not enough. And so I'm going to read this quote from the legislative record talking about that executive order to desegregate public housing. It says, "The road to segregation is paved with weak intentions, which is a reasonably accurate description of the federal establishment today. Its sin is not bigotry, though there are still cases of bold discrimination by federal officials, but blandness, not a lack of goodwill, but a lack of will." They go on. It says, when you ask one of these gentlemen why, despite the 1962 Fair Housing Order, most public housing is still segregated, he invariably blames it on regional custom, local traditions, personal prejudices of municipal housing officials. The upshot of all this is a federal attitude of amiable apartheid, in which there are no villains, only good guys. A world in which everyone possesses the truth, but nearly everyone seems to lack a sense of consequences. And the reality is this is what maintains our segregation today. We all know, the truth. We all understand what kinds of policies we need to pass and to create to address segregated housing patterns. But regional customs, local tradition, personal prejudices, and that blandness, that lack of will, still continue to shape our development decisions throughout our community. So housing segregation today is maintained through things like NIMBYism. And sometimes this is some quotes in response to the proposed construction of some affordable apartments in a suburban neighborhood. This was actually in the town of Cicero. And these are public quotes that the neighbors in that community had put up on a petition, an online petition in opposition to that affordable housing. And what they said was that they were looking to purchase a home in Cicero and do not want to be near a housing project. They talked about the potential increase in crime and were concerned about the type of people that would move to the area. And this quote, which is my favorite from someone who takes themselves very seriously, it says, "Such projects could disrupt community cohesiveness and its underpinnings, which are essential to its health, safety, and stability." Interestingly enough, what these residents of this community, and this was a neighborhood of single family homes, pretty nice homes, who were in opposition to that affordable housing, new affordable housing development. What they didn't realize is that they were actually already living across the street from an affordable housing development, a rural housing project that had been built in the 1970s. They were already living across the street from affordable housing and had never known that they actually built their homes across from affordable housing. But when there was talk about building affordable housing near them, they were up in arms. I attended some of the public meetings around for this project, and you know what people say publicly, of course, in petitions like this is one thing. I got to hear what they said privately, which you know was a lot of you know really race baiting and you know using you know underhanded terms. You know, weird concerns about things like buses and bus lines coming through in the area. And of course, stereotypical comments about children and children going to the schools and filling up the schools. But NIMBYism isn't reserved just for affordable housing developments. We also still see NIMBYism when looking at luxury housing. These are some, again, public comments in response to the proposed construction of luxury apartments in a suburban neighborhood. This is in Liverpool. And what the neighbors said was that they had moved to that neighborhood because they didn't want to live in the city with the riffraff or be around that the 108 apartments would bring all sorts of bad things to the neighborhood, and that they didn't want to be around those type of people with those type of problems, or they didn't want transients walking through their neighborhood. Now, these are luxury apartments that actually would have, actually I shouldn't say would have, they're being built, that will rent for higher than most of the mortgages in the neighborhood where these homeowners live. And the owner of the property stated that the opponents of those that were worried about those transient apartment dwellers should consider the alternatives, and that this is a deal far favorable to the building of factories or warehouses or Section 8 housing. So this is what was said, you know, publicly about this neighborhood. I happen to know some folks who live in this neighborhood. It's actually right by where I live. And what I found out from friends who live in that neighborhood and individuals that live in that neighborhood is that some of the neighbors were passing around petitions, getting neighbors to sign on in opposition, and specifically stating that Somalis were going to be moving into the neighborhood. And whether it is specifically identifying that it's Somalis moving into the neighborhood, or it's talk about those type of people with those type of problems, we still hear today this language of infiltration. We're still hearing the same language that was used in 1937 to describe neighborhoods in the city of Syracuse. We're still hearing that concern about infiltration of individuals, of less desirables into our communities. And sometimes our language is even more subtle, like communities who resist multifamily housing or apartments because of concerns about traffic or concerns about neighborhood character, which is a frequent one. And if you recall back to the slide from the legislative debate around the public housing and the failure to desegregate public housing, even in 1960s, people were using neighborhood character as an excuse, or regional customs as an excuse to maintain segregated communities, even back then. And we still see it used today. Or we see other types of coded language. This is a sign from a real estate agent, developer, housing developer, and a sign that they had posted at the CNY home show. And they had this sign that says, behind their booth, that said, located in a safe neighborhood setting. And I was kind of curious why they would put that sign up, which just seems kind of odd to put up as advertising for your office, until I realized that their office was located in the city. And if you look at real estate agents, real estate offices, not many of them are located in the city. Most of them are in the suburbs. It's particularly the big brands, the large real estate companies that are part of the national brands. And I realized they were putting up this coded language to make sure that people knew that it was safe to come to their office and that it was safe to do business with them. So we have a lot of work to do, right? You know, overcoming 80 plus years of systemic discrimination and systemic racism in housing, and of course all of the interconnected areas of people's lives, like education and employment. It requires a lot of work. But I think if we start by understanding this history, by having a shared understanding of this history, it's a good start. CNY for Housing will be publishing in the next couple of weeks a new fair housing assessment for the city of Syracuse and Onondaga County, where we're going to make some new recommendations on how to address housing disparities and improve housing equity in our community. We'll make sure that everyone who registered for this webinar today gets a copy of that, and we will be hosting another webinar in a couple of weeks where we'll be sharing some of the data and recommendations, and we hope that you'll join us for that as well. I'm happy to take questions at this point. I'll take a look at the Q&A. You can put any questions you have in the Q&A section. Someone just mentioned about NIMBYism being not in my backyard, which it is a good reminder what NIMBYism stands for. So yes, NIMBYism specifically stands for not in my backyard. You know, there is a kind of, in some communities, what's called a YIMBY movement, which is a yes in my backyard movement, which is of course great to see, where people are actively encouraging the development of affordable housing, more open housing opportunities in their community. A couple other questions. I'm curious to hear about CNY for Housing's involvement with the past, present, and future discussions of the near future of elevated I81 Downtown, and how will a diverted highway around Syracuse change housing in the city? So, you know, I hope we will be addressing the I81 in the fair housing assessment that'll be out in a couple of weeks, specifically, you know, advocating for policies to protect individuals that live around I81. You know, assuming, of course, that we will be seeing the community grid. Of course, everything is kind of probably on hold right now with I81, now that funding is with the pandemic and economic fallout from that. So we'll see what things look like in the coming months related to I81. But you know, we've been concerned with monitoring what's been going on. We've advocated with DOT to make sure that the voices of the people who are most impacted, that live next to the highway, are given primary concern. And you know, we hope, of course, that affordable housing opportunities are preserved within the city and the land that is going to be freed up by I81, as well as in the redevelopment of the East Adams neighborhood as part of the Blueprint 15 project. And we'll be advocating for the preservation of affordable housing and a right of return for individuals who live in that neighborhood. We've also been advocating for adequate mediation for people who live next to the highway during the construction period. Another question is, I hope that answers that. How do you respond to people who claim people tend to self-segregate? So I think, this is people choose where they live for a lot of different reasons. I can talk about how I chose where I live. I chose the house I lived in because it was near babysitters. I had family members who lived nearby who were going to watch my children, of course. And so I had free babysitters nearby. So that's why I chose the place that I live in. But of course, my family only lived in those neighborhoods because those are the neighborhoods that were available to them as white people. So we tend to have a perpetuation of those segregation patterns, even when people are choosing where they live and maybe choosing to live in a segregated community or around people of the same race or color. Those patterns are still a result of those same discriminatory practices, often because from the 1930s or starting in the 1930s. The idea of fair housing is that everyone should be able to choose where they live. And that is what we will always advocate for, is that people have a choice and that they have a lot of choices and that there's a lot of different options open to people and that people are welcomed into communities. Question about the city of Minneapolis eliminating single-family zoning laws. We are, I would say the state of Oregon also just eliminated essentially single-family zoning laws. Single-family zoning tends to limit the availability of affordable housing. It creates very exclusive communities. We have a lot of single-family zoning in Syracuse and in our suburban communities. We have other things in our suburban communities that kind of make that single-family zoning even worse. Things like minimum lot sizes or minimum building sizes that make those neighborhoods really, really hard to build any type of affordable housing, whether even single-family housing. And then, of course, we have whole communities, whole swaths of our city and our counties where it's almost impossible to build multifamily housing, or the zoning policies make it really difficult and cumbersome and more expensive to build multifamily housing. So I think, any effort that we can do to make it easier to construct multifamily housing, to construct affordable housing, to increase the diversity of our housing stock in our communities is a good thing. Whether that means eliminating single-family zoning laws, I think that's one area. I think there's a lot of things you can do kind of along a spectrum that would begin addressing those issues. And I'll just say we are also working on an effort this year to support essentially fair share housing and to address exclusionary zoning policies in our community. And our fair housing assessment looks a little bit at zoning and some of those exclusionary zoning policies and advocates for changing those as well. This last question is the easiest to answer. So yes, the PowerPoint will be available, and the maps that we shared today will be part of the fair housing assessment, but we will make the PowerPoint available so that you can have the maps that were in the presentation will be part of that as well. Make sure I am not missing them. There might be a couple more questions in the chat. Question that just came up. A lot of the time we see housing policies and discussions focused around the issue of concentrated poverty, yet the solutions that come out of this tend to put the onus on low-income individuals to move, break community ties, and often reduce the amount of affordable housing in an area. What is CNY for Housing's position on how to best attack the issue of concentrated poverty in Syracuse? So I just say the best way to address concentrated poverty is to bring people out of poverty. And to invest in people and to invest in neighborhoods. You know, I always think, and we always think that that is first and foremost what we need to do in our community to address concentrated poverty. So that the choice of remaining in your neighborhood is a good choice. Becomes that you don't have to choose between staying in the neighborhood that you grew up in and having, you know, decent schooling options for your kid, or having safe, you know, a safe community around you without vacant houses, or putting your kids at risk of lead poisoning and other things. So the best way to attack concentrated poverty is to, again, reduce poverty and invest in those neighborhoods. But I think we also need to invest in affordable housing in other areas. I don't think there's any reason why the city of Syracuse should have 75% of the affordable rental units, for example, in Onondaga County, and that we can and should invest in affordable housing in our suburban communities as well, and that we should be encouraging and working to get those developments built. I don't see any other questions here. Okay, I think we got all the questions. Thank you everyone so much for joining us today. We have 2 more sessions left in our virtual conference. Wednesday we'll be doing a Q&A on disability, and particularly around reasonable accommodations and modifications. And on Thursday, we'll be talking about affirmatively furthering fair housing and the HUD's sudden repeal of the affirmatively furthering fair housing rules that govern what municipalities could do in their communities. We'll have a discussion about that on Thursday as well. And we'll be sure to share any other upcoming events with you as they happen. So thank you all so much. Take care.